Perfect. Well, welcome everyone. So we're doing, this is our monthly luncheon, or not lunch and learn, sorry, it used to be called lunch and learn, but it's our learning series. We're having Trevor Cohen, Trevor Decker Cohen, author of A Bright Green Future, join us tonight. And it's just going to be a little bit of a discussion on how we can envision and create a sustainable and prosperous future. With that, I'm going to turn it over to Trevor. Thank you for joining us.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks so much for having me, Thaddeus. And good to see some familiar faces here. And yeah, first off, I have a lot of admiration for all the work that CCL does, and am on all of your mailing lists. So I've been contacting my senators and reps for the nth time, which is got to keep putting that pressure on. Hopefully they'll actually do something about it. Yeah, so I'm going to share a presentation for a different ideas that came about from a book that I wrote known as Bright Green Future, and we'll have a little bit of a discussion too throughout, kind of in response to some of the things that I present, as well as kind of a prompt to get everything started. So I'm just going to share my screen right now. You all can see that? Great.
Yes.
Okay, perfect. So yeah, as Thad said, my name is Trevor Cohen. I'm a writer that I primarily focus on hope at the edge of the climate crisis. And I spent the last 5 years interviewing innovators and activists who are working on building the foundation of a sustainable society across the country in many different ways. And really the culmination of that work was this book, Bright Green Future, that I wrote. But you know, in trying to steep myself in the hope and all of the things that we can be optimistic for, I must confess, sometimes I do feel a little bit like a hopeless romantic. The seas are rising, the land is drying out, we've got a polar vortex in one season, and then a firestorm in the next, especially if you're in California in the West. And that's not even talking about all of the political, economic, and cultural challenges to even actually do anything about it. But despite all that, I have felt that there is hope, and a lot of that comes from the fact that I think that in the climate movement, we think differently. I believe that we know that we can't solve the climate crisis with the same thinking that caused it. And so we view the future through a different lens. I believe that the way that we conceptualize our crises often defines the way we respond to them. And so with that in mind, I would like to ask this group a question to learn from your wisdom as climate activists and to better understand the way that you see the future. And so my question to you all has to do with the types of thinking change that we need in order to envision this sustainable society that we want to create. My question is, what types of thinking do you feel we need in order to break free from our fossil fueled economy and envision a sustainable society? So I'll let that sink in, and feel free to raise your hand and kind of give your thoughts on that. You feel free to, you can either put it in the chat or hop right in and say it, and we can have a discussion. Yeah, Drake, go for it.
Sorry, I'm late. I actually didn't, the calendar invite did not trigger a reminder. And so I was just sitting here thinking it was going to be later. In any case, the first thing that actually comes to mind when you ask this question is a shift away from individual action as a form of bringing about the necessary change for sustainability and creating a sustainable society. And what I mean by that is that we sort of have this image that, and by we, I mean society at large, that if you just buy a nice hybrid vehicle. And if you do your part in recycling, and if you get, your whole neighborhood to recycle and buy carbon neutral products, then you're going to make a serious impact. And that's very well intentioned. And I'm not saying to not do that, but I think we do need to move away from the fact that individual solutions or individual exercises of power are going to somehow bring us out of climate change. For example, what is it? 70% of greenhouse gas emissions are emitted by 100 corporations. It's nice that we tell ourselves this story that we can somehow prevent that with our own individual actions, eat beans instead of meat or eat more plants, but we need to start thinking on a larger societal scale and transitioning away from allowing those companies to operate as they currently do in order to, well, I guess, make a livable planet.
Yeah, thanks for sharing that, Drake. Yeah, that's a really good point, and really important to consider how there's definitely that narrative of like, oh, if like the contributions that we have as individuals can only be on an individual level. Like we can only like influence, we are consumers, or like we are we are consumers or conscious consumers. That's like the dichotomy that, or like narrative that's being set up. But I think CCL proves it's like, no, we are citizens. And when we as individuals get together in collective action, we can really make change. And so I think it's like acknowledging like what an individual can do working as a collective, rather than solely as like, we're all alone as individual consumers just trying to buy better. So thanks for that. Yeah, Sabrina, go for it.
Oh, I just wanted to make a quick connection between what Drake said. When Drake was saying about these 100 companies being mainly responsible, I think what we have to remember that these 100 companies are all of us. We buy products from these 100 companies. So I think that thought of we is really important, because part of the problem that we have had is that we point fingers rather than realize that it's all of us and it's a whole system. And that's a really hard one. In fact, one of the saddest things I heard was that Daniel Kahneman, one of my favorite psychologists, said, you guys are screwed, you are going against the way that humans think, right? Which is really in groups, in tribes, in the future, like a few weeks down, but not in long terms. Actually, I mean, I disagree with him because I think he has some ideas that will help us. But part of it is the need to think in terms of systems. And that's a really hard one. And we don't have to have everybody thinking in systems, just enough people to make the system change.
Yeah, no, thanks for that. Yeah, it's an interesting like intersection between like how we interact with the larger system and like what is our responsibility in it. Is there like complicitness? Like we're obviously benefiting from things, but didn't necessarily have a say in setting up those systems in the first place. Yeah, I think at least I would love to hear kind of more about what you said about follow up after about Daniel Kahneman and what he said. But yeah, interesting to see like that, how that plays with like how we set up the right incentives in that system to have an economy that's oriented in a way that's not harming the planet to a degree where it's unsalvageable. And where we lose everything. So yeah, I'd love to follow up after on what he said about that. Yeah. Anyone else? I have see other things in the chat I can loop on to. Anyone else wanted to jump in and say anything? Yeah, I like what you said, Ren, around like actually believing that we can, like like there's I would say this is maybe a little bit of a straw man argument, or straw person argument, where that the opposition to renewables and the sustainable future draws on examples of like, oh, would you want to go back to like what it was like in the 1700s when we had no electricity, and where we all grew our own food. And they kind of often point to that argument of like, well, this vision you have for sustainable future isn't realistic, and it's not something that's desirable. But I think really articulating like, what does a desirable sustainable future look like? And yeah, we obviously have progressed quite far in the reality of making that happen, through new developments in renewable energy technology, and so forth. So it is possible, and also connecting those things, those new technologies also to like, how do they play in our society in a way that's beneficial to us, and in a way that like provides like an attractive vision, that actually makes our lives better, than they were before. Drake, you want to jump in?
Yeah, sorry I feel like I'm speaking a little too much at this point, but what you said, I actually just recently saw a commercial, and I've seen it on repeat a lot, on, I forget which streaming service, but it is a guy and a girl, and they are getting ready for a date in their own respective homes. And each of them is using different products. Like one is putting in their contact lenses, one is putting in hair gel, shoes, putting on a leather jacket, and so on. And then about 30 seconds into the commercial, it rewinds from the very beginning, and it says like, now imagine a world without fossil fuels. And the contact lenses are gone, the leather jacket is gone, the hair gel is gone, the guy's glasses are gone, even some of the food, which I don't know how that was something that would be enticing to any viewer, but even some of the food on their dinner table was gone. But then it ends with somebody saying, this is what the world would look like if we didn't have fossil fuels. So think twice before you want to advocate for changing that. And in a way, they sort of have taken they've taken the message hostage, because they're able to kind of sway a lot of people by saying, well, yeah, I don't want things to change that much in terms of, I want to be able to order this, I want to be able to have these products. But there seems to be a big disconnect within the alternative resource community, I guess is what we would call it. But between the world we live in and the products that we can still have, but there are many alternative sources for that. Like there are alternative sources for plastic that are carbon neutral and biodegradable. And this doesn't get discussed as much as it possibly could. And I just wanted to comment on that it's pretty upsetting to see that is still something that, I don't know if it's swaying the public, but it's still out there. But I'm happy to see that a lot of people are kind of rejecting that, where they're like, well, that's sort of a garbage commercial, because nobody really believes that anymore.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's interesting. Yeah, I mean, we spent really the last almost 200, 150 years like innovating around fossil fuels, in terms of like all of the fertilizer applications, all of the materials applications that could come out of it. And now we're just, in the last few decades starting to innovate around alternatives to that, and plant-based and bio-based economies that are kind of alternative to the petro-based economy. And so, as we start to innovate and move into that realm more, we start to have viable alternatives that maybe even end up being better in some cases. But yeah, thanks. Marty.
Yeah, I just wanted to follow up on what Drake was saying, because I think there's an opportunity there. I'm just reminded of Catherine Hayhoe, who has told us that she goes in and she talks with the oil companies, and the first thing she says is, "Thank you. We wouldn't have the world we did today without that." So I the key she keeps putting in is, the first thing is acknowledging the kernel of truth. I mean, my grandfather delivered coal in a horse-drawn wagon. I wouldn't be here without that. So, you know, if we can rephrase it in a way that is less,
Us versus them.
yeah. If Sabrina was talking about pointing fingers, you know, acknowledge the kernel of truth, but then you quickly pivot to what you're saying is that. But now we're in a situation where we can maintain this stuff with this and this, this and this and this, because that takes the whole adversarial piece out of it. Or hopefully it does, it at least reduces it. Because you can, if you go down that hole, and I understand the temptation, believe me, because I've been down that rabbit hole myself. But then the conversation quickly becomes derailed, and you're arguing back and forth rather than moving forward. So just wanted to offer that.
Yeah, that's also, yeah, a good point. How, yeah, it is important not to, I mean, there's many different approaches for action and activism and how we put pressures. And it seems like at least CCL is definitely focused on collaboration and how do we focus on the solution rather than like solely on putting blame at the past, which I do really appreciate. And I think is really constructive that like, I think especially in a public messaging sense where it's like going out, the message is going out to a wider audience, like, you know, that kind of anti-fossil fuel or pro-fossil fuel ad was doing, when it's going out to that broader audience, like not like so much of our lives are tied up in fossil fuels, and so yeah, not creating unnecessary enemies of people who have, you know, 10 other major concerns throughout their day, but, you know, creating allies in the vision for what we're offering, what the better future we're offering is important, kind of in that public messaging realm. Yeah, so thank you. Just wanted to just circle back on the chat. I saw Josh posted something about considering future generations more explicitly in our cost/benefit calculations. Yeah, this is a really good point. You know, if you think about how a lot of Native American and indigenous cultures in the United States or in the Americas thought about planning, it was oftentimes 7-generation focused. So every action we have should be thought of in like how it's going to affect 7 generations from now, which is basically your great grandmother's great grandmother, is 7 generations in the past. And you know, the stuff we're doing today is going to affect more than 7 generations in the future. And so moving beyond like, so like, obviously we have all these incentives that are set up throughout our, you know, our professional lives around meeting these short-term goals. And so, yeah, it can definitely be hard to move beyond that. But I think it is really important to consider that long-term of how we are thinking about the impact on the earth and everything we do now affecting people very far down the line, because, you know, this climate change may affect a millennia. So it's very scary stuff. Let me just see. Yeah, Sarah, we need to be more proactive rather than reactive. Yeah, I like that too. And I think, yeah, I think we're in a, despite the, you know, the frustrations around reconciliation, I think that the climate movement has moved in that direction, of being more like articulating our vision, you know, within CCL and in your carbon fee and dividend, as well as looking at Sunrise and the Green New Deal, and really being proactive about this is the world we want to create, rather than just pushing back on fossil fuels and saying like this is the world we don't want. And so, yeah, I think that is a really good pivot that I think is happening more, and is, yeah, encouraging once we get there. Matthew Riley says, I wonder how we can put pressure on these companies that we will purchase from / directly and indirectly. It feels impossible given the size of these companies and the size of their consumer bases. Yeah, yeah, back to the kind of like consumer component of it. Yeah, I mean, there obviously is some pressure from shareholders and some pressure from consumers that are starting to influence like how branding happens. I don't know, that doesn't always that translates to a lot of greenwashing sometimes from companies, but there is definitely like this premium now put on sustainable things, whether that stays as like a premium product that, you know, not a small fraction of people buy their products that are quote unquote sustainable, whether that's like an effective method through kind of like the sustainability consumer focus on that, if that's something that could expand, or if, you know, we do need something bigger that's at like a governmental level, that's saying like, okay, you can't, like as companies, you can't do this, and you have these incentives to move towards a better system, whether it's through a price on carbon or price on other issues. So thanks. Great. Well, thank you all so much for your really thoughtful responses. It's been a great conversation so far, and I'm just going to go into the presentation and share. I mean, there are obviously so many different types of thinking that are crucial to moving beyond our fossil fueled economy and moving to the sustainable society. I wanted to share 3 different types of thinking that came up in my conversations with different innovators and activists. And these were like 3 really common threads that I noticed in all their stories and the way that they approach problems and innovated on different solutions. And yeah, I think a lot of these will look familiar to you from our conversation. Like Sabrina, you brought up the systemic thinking, which is really the first one on this list. So these 3 different types of thinking that I noticed, and I'll get into some specific examples of how they're applied and what they look like. Number 1 being systems thinking, which is really all about finding the deeper patterns that are hiding in plain sight, that are causing, like, below the surface, that are influencing the way markets and cultures and societies are set up and interact and intersect with each other, and trying to find solutions that address that larger system. Secondly is community thinking, which is really all about embracing local people as beneficiaries of change. And really, like, we do have to make a lot of changes, but how are those changes going to benefit people in the places where they live, either from a larger federal policy perspective or from local policies and local projects. And then thirdly is regeneration thinking, which is essentially all about creating both systems and communities that grow stronger and healthier over time, that rather than degrade with each passing year, each passing season, become more resilient and able to adjust to and respond to crises, as well as more robust and able to benefit from different opportunities that come up. So our first type of thinking here, systems thinking, is really all about seeing things as interconnected rather than as disconnected. It's about seeing things as circular rather than solely as linear. It's about seeing things rather than being in silos, separated, emerging at once, and how do multiple things emerge together and come out of the same soup. And it's about seeing the whole rather than solely the parts on their own. I wanted to share a story with you, just a brief story of a conversation I had when I lived in San Francisco that I think highlights the difference between a traditional reductionist type of thinking and systems thinking. And I like to call this story the parable of the techie and the farmer. So it was a conversation I had with, I guess, what you would call a serial entrepreneur, somebody who'd maybe started or said he'd started about 5 or 6 different companies, and kind of had this like vision of like tech can save the world. Like we could just hack all of our problems using engineering thinking and solve them. And one thing that came up in this conversation was we were talking about organic farming, regenerative farming, and the rise of soil health throughout the plain states and throughout the country. And he made the point that he said it's pointless. Like regenerative or organic farming is frankly BS. Like if we really wanted to store carbon in the earth, if we wanted to store carbon in the soil, we would just put a giant carbon capture machine on that land. And per acre, we could sequester a lot more carbon with a carbon capture machine over a regenerative organic farm. And I mean, it really highlights an approach that's solely focused on one metric. So this traditional approach of like, we're optimizing this one metric of sequestering carbon. But if you look at that same thing from a systems approach, you see that capturing carbon is really the only benefit provided by a carbon capture machine. Within a regenerative organic farm might sequester less carbon in the soil, but at the same time will hold water during times of drought better. It will provide flood protection and absorb water more. It grows healthy food, as well as providing a place for people to sometimes through a smaller interactive farm learn more about the connection between how the food system works and the land that sustains us, and kind of deepening that connection with how we think about the earth, and being a part and interacting with that flow. And really, if we take a step back and look at the way we've planned both our cities, the places we live, as well as the land that supports it through growing food, we start to see there's this predominant pattern of both cities and farms as monocultures. We focus when we build our cities. Often what we'll do is we'll maximize housing in one area, we'll maximize commerce in another area through strip malls or big shopping centers, and then separate industry in another area, and even like light industry and makers in another area. And we see the same thing in how we develop farmland, growing wheat in one area, corn in another, soybeans in another, and then livestock in a completely separate area. And while that system is very good at maximizing certain elements, it sacrifices the benefits that come from the systemic, holistic whole. And those being the kind of the magic that happens when different elements of a city are mixed into a neighborhood, in a walkable neighborhood, and all the benefits and interactions that come from that, as well as the benefits to the soil that come when we mix these different elements, different crops in rotation, that in some cases sequestering nitrogen, some crops sequestering nitrogen, animals providing fertilizer, plants providing forage. We end up sacrificing that when they're solely sequestered, and then that the monoculture has its own issues too. So what does it look like when we think about this differently? When we apply both the farm and the city, we apply a systemic lens to it. So this is an example in Gilbert, Arizona, of a community, or basically a neighborhood that was built around a regenerative organic farm. And it basically started where the Johnston family farm, this is kind of a common story, where a lot of farmland ends up being bought out and turned into subdivisions or large kind of suburban sprawl. And the family that was going to sell their land didn't want to do that. They talked to the developers. They wanted to do something different. They really wanted to preserve the sense of community that used to exist in smaller towns throughout the United States. And so what they did was they had them build a residential community, but also preserve some of the farmland where residents can access fresh produce from the farm. They also converted the old warehouse that used to hold tractors into a space for entrepreneurs to start new businesses, as well as kind of also have a storefront. There's a brewer that ended up, a couple breweries that got started in there, craft makers, a number of different co-ops and startups got started in there. And also in the old farmhouse, they created a restaurant. They built a coffee shop, little stores around the area. And by doing that, they created really a destination in the community. Rather than kind of, just an ordinary neighborhood, people come there on the weekends to visit the different craft makers. They come to eat at the restaurant or visit the coffee shop. People actually get married at the farm. And so it really provides all of these different benefits that you wouldn't necessarily have if you solely thought about maximizing these things separately from each other. That's just one example in Arizona and kind of a new thinking that's starting to take off. Secondly, we have community thinking. And that's really all about shifting the benefits of change to community. So, with fossil fuels, obviously we all benefit from being able to drive and use electricity. But the main beneficiaries of the revenue generated by fossil fuels are the fossil fuel companies themselves, utilities, and maybe the shareholders of those companies. But oftentimes that comes at the expense of the neighborhoods around fossil fuel plants that are next to refineries, and very little of the wealth actually gets shared with those communities. With renewables, we're starting to see a lot of new kind of models take shape that are focused on really shifting that benefit. We're going to have to obviously build we've built a lot of renewables, but we're going to have to build significantly more to decarbonize our grid. And in order to do that, in doing that, we have this opportunity to also shift some of the benefit of change. So one example is in California. There's this model known as community choice, and essentially it allows cities and counties to band together to choose basically where their energy comes from. They can choose, okay, we want X amount of solar, X amount of wind, and they can also choose how the excess revenue is spent. So oftentimes they'll prioritize different community projects with that. Some places actually give it back to the ratepayers as a dividend. Other cases like just work on procuring more renewables, and many are on track to get to 100% renewable by 2025. And while this started as just one county focused on this, it really expanded to now there's 22 community choice organizations, each kind of with their own focus on what local resources they have and what their local needs are related to energy. And now they provide electricity for half the state, and it's growing really rapidly. So there's a number of, this is being one example, a number of different models from community solar, community choice, different co-op models to focus on how do we also shift the benefits of change to communities as we, we have this opportunity as we expand our renewables. So another big part about community thinking is really adapting solutions to local needs and visions. So this is an example out of West Virginia in Appalachia that is this organization known as Coalfield Development that is focused on retraining laid off coal miners to do a number of different things, including transforming old surface mines into food forests. And essentially there's large areas in coal country where either mountains have been blown apart or large areas were just kind of mined at the surface level. And essentially what they do is they, in one example, they take this stone crusher machine in combination with pickaxes, a number of different tools, and convert that old mine into soil in which they plant a regenerative organic farm on top of and train people in new skills, as well as kind of generating new income in the area. And in addition to that, they've started like 5 different social enterprises. This one organization, one's a construction company that builds affordable housing. Another one is a solar company, and they also acquired a t-shirt company that makes apparel for Major League Baseball out of recycled materials. And so they've kind of created this ecosystem of different enterprises in an attempt to really diversify the economy in a place that was really beholden to one industry, that being coal. That now that coal is in free fall, it's kind of a precarious way to base our economy really on one resource and one thing. And so they're really diversifying the economy while providing a lot of job opportunities for people in kind of who become part of these different social enterprises. And at the same time, people get training through there. They get ability to complete a free associate's degree, as well as different counseling and like financial literacy classes and other stuff on top of that. And really, they're basing everything they do in Appalachian values of gumption, grit, and grace. So really their whole focus is that like we in Appalachia, they say, have these, we have this history of being able to make things really well, of being able to really make a living in challenging terrain, and to like, they see these values as being part of creating a regenerative and sustainable society in the future. So there's inspiration that can really come from everywhere, and it's adapted to the local community there, but has different inspiration that could be applied in other places. This is another example in South Dakota on the Pine Ridge Native American Reservation, where essentially indigenous activists there, they looked at what they basically had many different conversations with people in their community about what they wanted to see in the future, and what was their vision for a better world. And they looked at all of kind of the major challenges. They focused at being unemployment, which was around 70% in some cases, lack of access to healthy food, as well as a housing shortage. And so they kind of took all these multiple problems and thought about like, how do we combine both systems thinking with community thinking to address all of these different problems in one initiative. And so they created what they call a regenerative indigenous community, which trains youth in construction to build new housing to people who are lacking it there. and as well as a farm which they built, which provides fresh eggs for people on the reservation, as well as fresh produce. And the entire thing is powered by renewable energy. And there were a couple with solar, and there were a couple interesting stories of where people had been trained and had learned construction and actually built the houses that they eventually became homeowners in. And they also built a community center to have a number of different classes that people could take and learn new skills, as well as kind of skills around and a celebration of Lakota culture through different Lakota language classes and different other cultural classes that really speak to celebrating their heritage and kind of their local values. And at the same time, they innovated kind of a new way around urban design and how we think about urban planning. Oftentimes when we think about like walkable cities, we look back to European models of like kind of the old European city, but they designed a lot of their neighborhoods that they put in this community, which they hope to have eventually 900 people living there, around like the way that they used to camp and set up tents. And they're kind of created this model for what is a Native American urban planning look like, and how can, you know, they have had indigenous nations throughout the United States throughout the Americas have for millennia live sustainably with the land and been stewards of the land. So they're kind of applying this knowledge of how can we create communities and cities in a way that is sustainable and kind of draws on that wisdom. And so lastly, we have regenerative thinking. And so regeneration can be thought in many different ways. It can be thought of regenerating the land. So with regenerative agriculture, it's really focused on how when we have each passing season, how are we setting up our system to create something that gets stronger and more robust over time. And so through the way we design both and integrate different livestock with trees and with different crops, how are we recharging the soil every year so that their next cycle starts off better than the one before, and we have to use less inputs rather than degrading the land more every year. This is an example from Minnesota of an organization called the Regen Ag Alliance, which has developed this scalable permaculture system that combines both chickens with fruit trees and different grains and crops. And the founder, Reginaldo Hazlet Marroquin, trains migrant farm workers in how to create kind of their own farms using this model, and that he's shown has been able to increase their income significantly, as well as heal the land at the same time. And he draws on the wisdom of rainforest systems, like really looking at an acre not as 40,000 something square feet, but as a three-dimensional space that has trees going 20 feet up and roots going 10 feet down. And how do we have this whole system that's focused on taking energy from the sun and converting it into food across this whole canopy. And he compares all of the chicken manure, the leaf litter, as things that we're putting back into the soil battery so that our cycles get stronger every year. We can also think about regenerating materials too. So thinking about the larger cycles that are in our different products throughout our lives, and what does that system look like of all the materials flowing through our modern economy. So if we take some of the most exotic materials we have that are in our electronic devices, oftentimes because we don't always have the right systems in place or facilities in place to recycle them, a lot of our used electronics ends up overseas in somebody else's backyard, and they have to often go through it and refine it in a way that ends up creating really toxic situations in neighborhoods from ecological and social perspective. This is an example in British Columbia of a company known as Ronin 8 that regenerates e-waste, including lithium-ion batteries, using this interesting technology that essentially uses sound energy. It's kind of like a massive tuning fork that is able to separate out many different materials. So what they do is they grind up e-waste in water to prevent it from creating hazardous dust. And then they use the sound energy to separate out the fiberglass and the metals, and then all the different metals from each other, the copper, the tin, the silver, lead, gold, palladium, even all of the rare earth metals that are often end up just getting wasted, and start to see like this many different cycles as if like an entire periodic table of metals within our devices start to emerge, and really thinking about like if we have an economy that's based on like creating the next gadget and making things obsolete within the next year to 6 months, we really need to be focused on how we regenerate all of those materials. If our product cycles are so short, we need to also have material cycles that can match it. So that's really what they're focused on. And also a big focus is how do we recycle lithium-ion batteries, and they are able to do that in a safe and non-toxic way, to kind of redefine like what does a battery look like as if it were like a plant or something, where it absorbs energy. A plant absorbs energy, and then at the end of its life, when it's no longer able to do that, its materials become absorbed to create another plant. And so really putting that same thinking into renewable technology, our solar panels, our lithium-ion batteries should be cycled in the same way, similar to a plant in how it absorbs energy. But then, when it's no longer able to stand up and hold up, its materials give the feedstock for the next cycle of energy absorbing systems. And then lastly, we have regenerating people, which is really about kind of energizing our confidence and our skills and our kind of spirit to be able to face the huge challenges in front of us. This is Soulfire Farm in upstate New York, outside of Albany, that trains Black and Indigenous people of color to start their own regenerative organic farms, as well as kind of training courses and community farms that both provide healthy food, as well as also provide skills for people in the community and to interact with food, and to kind of increase that connection between the land that was often stolen from people, and people were taken off the land, and really reconnect that, and kind of training trainers across the country to kind of start their own kind of community initiatives and have this like ripple effect of like many different community farms where more people where sustainability becomes more accessible as well, and more tangible and real in people's lives. So that's the end of my presentation. If you want to get more inspiration, you can get a copy of the book. These stories and many more are available in my book, Bright Green Future. It's available at brightgreenfuture.com. You can get 15% off if you use the code Climate Lobby at checkout. And you'll get a signed copy as well. I have a big stack of books right here, fresh, ready to go. And so yeah, I'd be happy to send them your way, brightgreenfuture.com. Or if you want to get in touch, would love to hear any ideas, feedback, as well as, just if you just wanted to chat or share anything, feel free to reach out to me at trevor@brightgreenfuture.com. Yeah, thank you so much. I hope this was interesting. And yeah, we'll definitely leave the rest of this time for any questions you have or thoughts or reactions to the presentation. Any questions?
Excellent presentation, Trevor. It was, it's good to see that there are so many innovative companies, organizations out there. And I'm sure that's just the tip of the iceberg.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, there was, it's really a renaissance that's happening right now. Although it might seem small scale in some sense, it's like there is, in every place there's something going on. And I think something that's really inspiring about the work that you do at CCL is being able to, at the higher level, redirect the incentives that we have at kind of a systemic level, so that all of these kind of change makers that I mentioned, they're no longer really the outliers in their community, where it's, a lot of these people that I mentioned do get funding from the government, like some from state level, some from federal level, from housing and human development, and urban development. And so there is really this big opportunity at the higher level to make kind of a flourishing of all these things that have really tangible benefits in our communities, as well as decarbonize our future.
If you'll allow me, I'll just make a plug for the book, in that I read it over the summer. It was my beach reading and it was perfect because I felt like I was staying engaged, but it was the right mentality for sit on the beach. But what I really loved about it is that, Trevor was just saying, it's showing really specific examples of what people are doing, but also gives really good examples of, it's not that we have to give up things. It's not about giving up meat or turning your thermostat down or, not driving places. It's really about, if we actually are realistic about what the problems are and what kind of solutions are available, how the solutions are actually better than what we have now, which I've really appreciated. This is a book that I've shared with my kids, whereas a lot of times I have a hard time talking about climate issues with my kids because it's hard. But this has been a book that has really kind of helped me, okay guys, put your thinking caps on and be creative. This is the problem, here are some example solutions, and this can actually show you a world that is better than what I grew up in. So I really thank you, Trevor, for that, because it's been something that I've needed and really appreciated over the past several months.
Oh, thanks so much for that, Ren. That's really, really kind of you. Yeah, I really appreciate that. And yeah, I think that was really my hope in the book, is to provide a kind of to get people's to think creatively and to really think expansively about how good of a world we can create if we really put our minds to it and really focusing on that creativity. But yeah, totally, Rachel. It was a debate about should I be printing books about environmentalism. Hopefully they're getting passed around and not ending up in the trash. I did actually talk to somebody at another CCL who said after he finished his, he put it in his little little neighborhood library box thing, and I think somebody picked it up. So definitely like try to get as much mileage as these print books as possible, and then hopefully there'll be a way to cycle them back in. But yeah, that is the reality. Cool. Hey, yeah, Matthew, go ahead.
Earlier when you were talking, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay. Earlier when you mentioned the metal recovery a few slides ago, it got me thinking about, I recently moved out to Ocean City, Maryland for the winter, and I was appalled to find out that they have a trash program that has no recycling, and everything is shipped to a company called Covanta, where it seems like they burn the trash and then recover the metals. And going through their website, they are touting themselves as environmentally friendly for sure. But I was just wondering what you think about that. It certainly doesn't seem friendly to me.
Yeah, I mean, incineration, yeah, is definitely a pretty crude way to get rid of things. It's like cheap and simple. Yeah, I've heard of certain like pyrolysis incineration where it's like, I guess you're basically breaking stuff down in a low oxygen environment. That's apparently not creating as much smoke, and they can use that to refine and to create like kind of almost like petrochemical feedstock from that, from products. But yeah, I mean, yeah, incineration is definitely not ideal. It is, yeah, take care, Ren. But yeah, we definitely, there is this whole focus now on the circular economy, as in terms of like how that gets integrated with our local recycling systems, and like how we, okay, yeah, it's New Jersey too. Their incinerators pollute the air. Thanks, Linda. Yeah, it's not great. And yeah, in terms of it actually being integrated with our local recycling systems, I think we definitely need something around extended producer responsibilities, more robust legislation around that, to where we actually get to seeing that in a real sense beyond, you know, I just mentioned like a cool startup, and there's like 1,000 cool startups like that. Take care, Mary. Yeah, to actually get to integrating that with our systems, there needs to be something bigger, and it's, yeah, I hope that we are able to do something about that. Cool. All right, looks like we're at time. Thank you so much for all your great contributions and questions. And yeah, feel free to reach out if you want to continue the conversation. Yeah, also hats off to all the work you do, and have been doing for over a decade at CCL. It's inspiring, and I continue to lobby my Congress people, or not lobby, but to do the bare minimum of sending them a call and all that. So thank you all for all the work you do.
Yeah, and thank you,
you much,
Trevor.
Trevor.
Thank you,
All
Trevor.
right.
Thank
Thanks
you
a lot.
very much.
Take care.
Good night.
Very
Bye.
much.
Thanks. Have a good